If I were 70 years old today, I would stop pretending that investing is still the same game it was when I was 40. That is one of the most expensive lies people carry into old age. They think the strategy that built the fortune must also be the strategy that protects it. They think the aggression that was once rewarded must still be admirable. They think the risk that felt acceptable when wages were coming in, when years were plentiful, when mistakes could still be corrected by work and time, should still be tolerated after the paychecks stop and the portfolio becomes the machine that feeds the household. Number at 70, the rules change. Not because you became weaker, because time became more valuable. That is the truth. The financial industry does not like to tell people, because the truth is rarely as profitable as confusion. Confusion sells products. Confusion sells complexity. Confusion sells the idea that safety can be found in some expensive structure wrapped in impressive language and offered by a man whose suit costs more than your first car. I have spent my life around capital, and I can tell you something with complete sincerity. The older you get, the less useful cleverness becomes and the more useful plain safety becomes. That sentence will disappoint the wrong kind of investor. Good. The wrong kind of investor at 70 is usually a younger man trapped in an older body. He still wants the thrill. He still wants the chase. He still wants to feel that the big score is just one right allocation away. He still wants to tell himself that he is in the accumulation years when he is actually in the preservation years. That confusion ruins people. I have watched it ruin people who were otherwise intelligent, disciplined, and successful through most of their lives. They were perfectly sound in their 40s. They were respectable in their 50s. They entered their 60s with a good name, a fine career behind them, a decent house, a portfolio built over decades, and the kind of life that should have become calmer from there. Then they made the fatal mistake. They failed to change the mission, and the mission at 70 is no longer to become rich. The mission is to remain safe. That difference sounds subtle when spoken aloud. In real life, it is enormous. A man trying to become richer at 70 will reach for growth, yield, and excitement. A man trying to remain safe will ask different questions. He will ask whether principal can vanish. He will ask whether the income can be counted on. He will ask whether the money is reachable on the day it is needed, not on the day some advisor claims it should be needed. Those are the right questions. Every other question is secondary. I want to begin there because the whole problem starts with a corrupted definition of safety. The financial industry uses that word the way an over-friendly salesman uses the word trust me. It uses it far too casually high. Yield bonds are called safe because they pay interest. Annuities are called safe because somebody somewhere has attached an insurance guarantee to them. Dividend stocks are called safe because the companies have been around and because the checks kept coming for a while. Real estate is called safe because it is tangible. Private credit is called safe because it is dressed in institutional language. This is all nonsense unless you begin with the right test. At 70, a truly safe investment must satisfy three conditions. First, your principal must not be at real risk of permanent impairment. Second, the income promised must arrive without drama, without reinterpretation, without a board meeting suddenly deciding that this quarter requires sacrifice from the shareholders. Third, the money must be accessible when life asks for it. That is safety, not yield alone, not familiarity, not the pleasant sound of a product brochure. Safety is preserved principal, reliable income, and liquidity. Almost everything sold to retirees fails one of those tests. Many fail too. Some fail all three and still get marketed as prudent. I once knew a man named Harold who retired with more than $2 million. He should have been secure. He had saved, invested, worked, deferred gratification, and done the sort of things the culture praises. His advisor placed him in what was called a balanced portfolio, though it was balanced only in the way a man standing on one foot is balanced if you do not look too closely. The portfolio leaned heavily toward stocks because growth, he was told, was necessary. If he wanted the money to last, he had to keep reaching. Then came a real downturn. The account fell hard, not 10%, not one of those declines people discuss lightly over lunch. A serious decline. the kind that makes a retiree stare at the screen longer than he should and then stop sleeping the way he used to. He panicked, sold near the wrong point, and spent the rest of his life haunted by arithmetic. He was no longer enjoying his money. He was guarding what remained of it with the nerves of a man convinced the next bill might be the one that finally proved he was not as safe as he had been told. That is not retirement. That is captivity with a nice lawn. I received a letter many years ago from a woman who had watched something similar happen to her husband. They had enough on paper, they absolutely had enough. Then markets cut the numbers so sharply that his confidence never recovered. The stress invaded the marriage, the household, the health, and eventually the body itself. People think money trouble is only about bills. It is not. It is about the pressure that changes how a person breathes, how he sleeps, how he sees the next 10 years, how much humiliation he quietly expects from life. A 70-year-old should not be living under that pressure if it can be reasonably avoided, and in many cases it can, not by becoming brilliant, by becoming honest about what this season of life is for. If I were 70 and forced to protect every meaningful dollar I had built over a lifetime, I would narrow my world radically. I would not own 20 things that only sound safe. I would own 3 categories that are actually safe in the way retirees need safety to mean something. The first is short-term United States Treasury securities. The second is a low-cost S&P 500 index fund, but only for the portion of money I know I will not need for a long time. The third is cash held properly in insured or treasury, backed liquid form as a reserve. That is it. That answer is not sexy enough for Wall Street. It is not complicated enough for the advisor who wants to justify a complicated fee structure. It is not glamorous enough for the retiree who still wants to feel aggressive and current and clever. That is exactly why I trust it. Let us begin with the first one, because it is the most important. Short-term treasuries are the closest thing the world offers to true financial sleep. I do not say that lightly. When you buy a short-term treasury bill or a short treasury note, you are lending money directly to the United States government for a defined period. There is no mystery in that arrangement. There is no fragile business model between you and repayment. There is no management team whose judgment you are hoping does not deteriorate. There is no dividend committee deciding whether the payout still feels comfortable. There is no property market waiting to discover that demand in your zip code has cooled. There is simply a promise from the sovereign issuer of the currency. Now, clever people always rush in here with a line about the national debt. They tell me the debt is large. Of course it is large. I can read too. But debt size and default capacity are not the same discussion when the debt is denominated in the government's own currency. The United States can tax. The United States can issue currency. The United States can meet dollar obligations in dollars. That does not eliminate inflation risk over long periods. It eliminates the kind of default risk people should be frightened by when they are 70 and living off capital. Those are different animals. A long-term inflation problem is serious, but it is not the same as failing to receive your principal or your coupon because the borrower collapsed treasuries protect against the second risk magnificently, and short-term treasuries do something else that long-term bonds do not. They avoid serious duration pain. This is where many people who thought they owned something safe learned a humiliating lesson in 2022. Long-term bondholders discovered that a bond can be sound as a credit and still behave viciously as an investment when rates move against it. A 30-year bond can lose frightening amounts of market value when yields rise. That is acceptable. If you are 40 and intellectually amused by volatility, it is much less acceptable if you are 72 and trying to preserve purchasing power and sleep. Short-term treasuries do not carry that same cruelty. If your bill matures in 3 months, 6 months, or a year, there is not enough runway for rate changes to do lasting violence to you. The principal comes due soon. The time horizon is short, the sensitivity is limited, the uncertainty is lower. That matters more than people think. People spend too much time worshiping yield and not enough time respecting maturity structure. At 70, maturity structure is not a footnote. It is part of your emotional safety system. I want you to imagine a retiree with $1 million. If half or more of that capital is in short-term treasuries, yielding something in the general range of 4 to 5%, that retiree is producing substantial income from an instrument with essentially no default drama and limited rate sensitivity. That is not thrilling cocktail, party talk. It is profoundly useful real life that income can pay bills. It can reduce the need to sell stocks at bad times. It can lower anxiety. It can give a household a floor. A floor matters. People underestimate the importance of floors because floors are not aspirational. But in late life, the floor is often what decides whether the whole psychological structure of retirement remains calm. A retiree without a reliable income floor becomes hostage to market mood. A retiree with a floor can treat volatility as a weather event rather than a referendum on his survival. That is an enormous difference. There is another quiet virtue in short-term treasuries. They mature. That sounds obvious until you understand what it means emotionally. When a treasury bill matures, you have a decision to make. Spend, reinvest, reallocate, or wait. That is flexibility. You are not trapped. You are not paying surrender charges to an insurance company. You are not selling an apartment building in a weak market. You are not begging a board to maintain the dividend. The instrument finishes and you are free to choose again. Freedom is one of the most valuable qualities in late life investing. It deserves more admiration than it gets. If I were 70, I would likely keep the majority of my portfolio in that first bucket, 50% at the low end for many people, 60, perhaps even 70 for someone deeply conservative or heavily reliant on the portfolio for everyday life. Why so much? Because safety is not a garnish, it is the entrar fy. When the dinner is retirement, I want the main dish to be edible, even if every side item disappoints. Now, some people hear that and say, Buffett, you are turning a retiree into a bond clerk number. I am turning a retiree into someone who still owns his own breathing. That is much more important. The second category is where nuance enters. A low-cost S&P 500 index fund is. In my judgment, the only stock exposure I would insist on for a typical person over 70 who still wants growth without pretending he can pick winners better than the market itself. Notice I did not say stocks are safe in the same way treasuries are safe. They are not. A broad index fund is not safe over 1 year. It is not safe over 2. It is not even guaranteed to soothe you over 5, depending on when you started and how the world behaved, but over longer periods. Broad American productive enterprise has been among the greatest creators of wealth humanity has ever devised. That is not hyperbole. It is history. The S&P 500 is not one company. It is 500 of the largest surviving American businesses at any given time, constantly refreshed, constantly cleansing itself, constantly ejecting weakness and weighting strength more heavily as the economy evolves. Individual firms die. The system adapts. That is one reason indexing is such a beautiful instrument for the ordinary person. It lets you own the machine instead of pretending you can always identify the best piston in advance. Why would I own it at 70? Because age 70 is not always age 80. Many people who reach 70 still have 15, 20, sometimes more years ahead of them. That is enough time for a portion of the portfolio to remain in growth assets, provided that portion is truly segregated in the mind as long-term money. That phrase matters. Long-term money is money you do not need to touch when markets misbehave. If you cannot make that commitment, then the stock bucket is too large. That is the rule. The size of the stock allocation should not be determined by greed. It should be determined by how much volatility you can truly survive without being forced into self-harm. That is why I distrust advisors who blithely keep retirees in heavy stock allocations. Because the spreadsheet says growth is needed. Growth may indeed be needed. But a spreadsheet that assumes perfect behavior under stress is a fantasy document. The real question is not only whether growth improves the long-run outcome. The real question is whether the investor will remain in the seat long enough to receive that long-run outcome. In 2008, many did not. That is the danger. A retiree who panics and sells after a great decline does not live in average return mathematics anymore. He lives in realized loss mathematics and realized Loss mathematics are merciless. This is why temperament becomes part of the asset allocation. A low-cost index fund is safe only for money with time and an owner with discipline. That combination is what makes it safe enough, not the ticker alone. Still, I want some of that exposure. I want inflation protection over the long run. I want the American earnings engine working on my behalf. I want the capacity for the portfolio to grow, not merely survive. I want the possibility of leaving more, not just preserving what I had. And for all of that, the broad index is magnificent. I would not own it through an expensive active manager. I would not pay 1% or more a year for somebody to underperform the market while explaining himself elegantly on conference calls. Fees are termites. They work silently. They are especially intolerable when the investor no longer has decades of labor income to easily replace what the termites ate. So I want the plain index. The cheap one, the one that does not need a speech. If I were over 70, I would likely keep roughly 20 to 30% there, depending on the rest of my situation. If I had a generous pension and Social Security covered most of my needs, I could afford to let that bucket be a bit larger, because the day-to-day portfolio pressure would be lower. If my portfolio needed to produce nearly everything I lived on, I would keep that bucket smaller because forced selling risk would matter more. Asset allocation is biography translated into percentages. Never forget that. The third category is cash. I know what young men say about cash. They say cash is trash. They say inflation destroys it. They say fully investing is the mark of seriousness. Young men say many silly things because life has not yet charged them enough for certainty. Cash in retirement is not there to outperform anything. Cash is there so that life does not get to bully you into bad decisions. That is its job. If the roof must be replaced, cash handles it. If the grandchild needs help, cash handles it. If there is a medical shock, a family emergency, a tax obligation, a move, or simply a period when markets are ugly and patience needs reinforcement, cash handles it. A retiree with enough cash behaves differently from a retiree with none. He sleeps differently. He reacts differently. He does not look at every market drop as a direct threat to groceries and dignity. That is one reason I refuse to sneer at cash for older people. Cash is not laziness. Cash is optionality. It is the freedom not to sell. That freedom can be worth much more than the small difference between a perfectly efficient portfolio and a humanly survivable one. Again, I do not want dead cash if I can avoid it. There is no reason to leave large balances languishing in a checking account paying next to nothing when high-yield savings vehicles and Treasury money market funds exist. I want the cash earning something reasonable while staying liquid, but I do want the cash 1 year of essential living expenses at a minimum for many people, 2 years for some. Enough so that ordinary emergencies remain ordinary. This is another area where the financial industry often gives retirees terrible advice. It tells them fully investing is sophistication. I think fully investing without respect for human fear is stupidity. The older the investor, the more expensive that stupidity becomes. Let me say it more simply. At 70, you do not need to be fully invested. You need to be fully protected. That is a different target. Now, if you combine these three categories correctly, the whole picture becomes very elegant. The short-term treasuries are your income floor and principal fortress. The index fund is your long-run growth engine. The cash is your emergency bridge and psychological shock absorber. That is a complete system. It is not designed to make you richer than all your neighbors. It is designed to keep you from becoming one of the tragic people who did everything right for 40 years and then lost their peace, because they failed to adapt the final strategy to the final stage. This is the point most people resist. The goal at 70 is no longer more. The goal is enough income, enough stability, enough liquidity, enough growth, so inflation does not slowly humiliate you. Enough simplicity that you can understand what you own without calling 3 different people to interpret the monthly statement. Enough protection that you can spend your days thinking about people and places and books and grandchildren and hobbies and whatever else makes your life worth having, rather than thinking constantly about the next market headline. That is what a good late life portfolio should buy. Not excitement. relief. I remember talking to a man once who had more money than he needed and less peace than any man with that amount of money had a right to have. He was in private placements, high-yield bond funds, a couple of annuity products. He did not fully understand. Some structured notes sold to him as enhanced income and an equity allocation that still behaved as though he were 48 and indestructible. Every month he received papers that were thick enough to stop a bullet and clear enough to explain nothing. He kept asking whether he was safe. The answer was no, but not for the reason he thought. He thought the problem was the market. The problem was structure. He had bought complexity when what he needed was durability. He had bought yield when what he needed was certainty. He had bought products when what he needed was plain instruments. He had hired salesmen when what he needed was subtraction. That is why I am so severe on this point. The financial industry makes a great deal of money by persuading older people that what they need is more design. Often what they need is less complexity, less dependence on market mood, less exposure to permanent principal loss, less faith in promises they cannot verify, less need to be clever. Simplicity is not primitive. At 70, simplicity is often the most intelligent luxury available. I would rather own 3 things I understand perfectly than 9 things that sounded sophisticated in a conference room. That brings us to a practical question. What might a $1 million retirement portfolio look like under this framework? I am not giving universal law here, only an illustration of temperament translated into money. Perhaps $550,000 in short-term treasuries, perhaps $300,000 in a low-cost S&P 500 index fund, perhaps $150,000 in liquid cash or treasury money market structures. That is one possible shape. It will not impress an ambitious grandson who has just discovered margin and thinks all caution is cowardice. It will impress the person who understands sequence of returns risk. That phrase matters, so let me pause on it. A person in his accumulation years can survive a bad early market experience if he keeps working, keeps saving, and keeps buying more shares. A person living off the portfolio does not have the same luxury. If the market falls sharply early in retirement and withdrawals must continue, then damage compounds in the wrong direction. Shares are sold at low prices. Future recovery operates on a smaller base. Time does not merely heal. It may expose. That is why volatility is not neutral at 70. The same decline that is survivable at 40 can be psychologically and mathematically devastating at 72. This is not because the older investor is weak. It is because the portfolio is now functioning as income, not merely hope. Once you understand that, the case for safety becomes almost too obvious to argue with. Yet people still argue because greed never fully ages out of the human system. The 70-year-old can still be seduced by the idea of higher return. He can still be embarrassed to hold cash. He can still want to prove to himself that he is not one of the timid old people. That vanity is expensive. I would rather be a timid old man with a calm account than a proud old man forced to pray for market conditions he no longer controls. There is another question people ask. What about inflation? I take inflation seriously. It is a thief, but there are different ways to protect against different thieves. Chasing yield in risky assets is not always inflation protection. Sometimes it is merely principal destruction wearing an income hat. The combination of short-term treasuries, cash, and a measured equity allocation gives you a much more honest defense. The treasuries and cash preserve stability and optionality. The stock allocation preserves long-run purchasing power through ownership of productive enterprise. That is a sensible balance. Could inflation still sting? Yes. Could a stock-heavy approach hurt more in the wrong sequence? Absolutely. This is always about trade-offs. I am not promising a world without discomfort. I am offering a world with far less chance of catastrophe. That is the only honorable promise in retirement investing. Some people worry that this framework leaves less to heirs than a more aggressive one might, perhaps. But I would remind them of something very important. The greatest gift you can give your children is not the maximum possible inheritance under rosy assumptions. The greatest gift is not becoming their financial emergency because you reached too far, trusted the wrong product, or confused old age investing with middle age accumulation. If you remain secure, independent, and calm, you have already given them something large. If some growth remains because the index fund compounds and the spending needs stay moderate, wonderful, that is gravy. But the core duty is not to gamble your final decades in order to leave the largest number behind. The core duty is to live safely enough that the people who love you are not forced to become your rescue plan. That is how I see it, and I have seen enough money and enough suffering to trust that view. The happiest retirees I have known were not always the richest retirees. They were the least frightened. They had a system simple enough to understand, strong enough to trust, and liquid enough to adapt. They were not checking markets every hour. They were not explaining structured products to their spouses over breakfast. They were not hoping that some manager in another city had gotten the derivatives right this quarter. They had built a life in which the money was serving them instead of forcing them to serve it. That is the whole point. You spend decades building capital so that one day capital can finally behave like a servant. Do not reach 70 and make it your master again. If I were 70, I would own short-term treasuries with conviction. I would own a low-cost S&P 500 index fund with discipline. I would keep enough cash to stay free from panic. I would let complexity pass by me like a salesman shouting from the curb. I would accept that enough is now a more intelligent word than more, and then I would get on with living. That is the final part people forget. A sound retirement portfolio is not an end in itself. It is a support beam for life. Once the beam is strong enough, stop staring at the beam and go enjoy the house. That is what your money should do for you at 70. Not tempt you, protect you, not excite you, free you. That, to me, is what safety finally means.